Well, Raj, thanks so much for joining us here on the Build Podcast. It's great to have you on the show.
I'm excited to be here. I'm a huge fan of your podcast, and I listen to your shows all the time.
Awesome. Well, now we're turning the tables and you're going to be on it. So let's dive in here. First off, let's level set on what we mean by brand marketing. So what exactly is brand marketing and why is it valuable?
Yeah, the way to think about brand marketing is almost like the personality of your product or your company. Think about every single interaction you're having with your customer. A customer is having let's do it again. Let's do it again. So when you think about brand marketing, it's almost like a personality of your company or your personality of your product. Think about every single interaction you're having with the customer. That's what defines your brand personality. Let me ask you a very specific example, right? We will all use products like Lyft and Uber for ride sharing, right? They're almost the same product. Almost gives you, from a feature perspective, it's almost exactly the same. But the perceptions of the brand are so different from each other, right? I remember a few years back, some of my friends and coworkers refused to, use Uber. They all use Lyft. It's not the product was bad, but it was the brand perception. Similarly, if you think about a very specific example for B2B, Slack and HipChat, right? HipChat was pretty well known among the tech community, right? So the perception became that this is a messaging solution for developers. Whereas Slack, early on, basically figured it out that the way to positioning Slack was for all kind of teams, right? So, the brand perception makes a lot of difference nowadays, and more as CMOs, even PLG CMOs are realizing the importance of brand.
Yeah, my favorite example is always MailChimp. Obviously, it's a little bit different these days now that it's owned by Intuit, but MailChimp it's a commodity product. There's a lot of email marketing solutions out there. And yes, it's a good product. And yes, it's, kind of been around for a while and it's built a great following, but they also created a brand, and
right.
I've never signed up for, I'm not a marketer. I don't use MailChimp, but I love their branding so much. There was actually a few years ago, they had this campaign where, their mascot, the chimp, Freddie, they made action figures out of Freddie and all these different kinds and stuff. And so, and you could get one for free if you sort of entered a competition. And I got one, and it's this thing that I love that sits on my desk is this little action figure of Freddie from MailChimp. And I love it, even though I'm not a customer, right? So that's a great example of brand done well to stand out in sort of a sea of vendors that kind of do the same thing, but to really sort of speak to somebody and have a personality in a really major way. So yeah, there's some great examples out there, both in consumer as well as in B2B.
Another good example is, since you bring up, taco from Chalo. There's a lot of our customers basically talked about how they enjoyed the taco as an emblem for the Chalo brand. So that's another good example.
So why is brand so valuable, and why should we dive deep into it?
Yeah, so I think the way B2B marketing we used to do 20 years back and the way we do now is changing. And the reason it's changing is if you think about the B2B buyers 20 years ago and the B2B buyers now are very different from each other. This is the Facebook generation, this is the the smartphone generation. Their expectation is for a company to be not like a robot, but be a human, right? So kind of it reflects in your brand to some extent, like how you're having a conversation with your customer. Nowadays, it is becoming, that's why I think it is becoming more and more important. More and more B2B companies are investing in brand. drive on, like in San Francisco, for example, you're surrounded by billboards everywhere.
Yeah, just take a trip down 101. You'll see a lot of brand advertising.
Yeah, you'll see a brand because everyone realizes that, brand is becoming more and more important. And it's surprising that a lot of conversation around PLG is obviously growth marketing and growth hacking, quote unquote, right? A lot of conversation is how do you use how do you build an enterprise outbound motion on top of a PLG motion? But I think, what is going to separate from the good companies from the great companies are basically companies which can do all the three pillars really, really well. PLG, enterprise outbound motion, and brand.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's, on why brand and why is it impactful, what kind of impact can it have? I mean, we sort of talked with the MailChimp example and a few of the other examples earlier. It can differentiate you. If you have a less differentiated product because there's a lot of sort of similar products in the market, you can be different through brand. People feel differently about you, even if the functionality is fairly similar. So there's a differentiating element to brand, and it can certainly sort of create that opportunity. But I think also there's a scalability opportunity around your marketing. At some point, you just can't buy more of the same keyword, right? Like you're already getting all of that. And at some point, like all your demand generation, it's good. You always have to have that, but it doesn't scale infinitely. But brand is something, you can also waste a lot of money doing it, but if you do it right, it's sort of infinitely scalable. I mean, look at any of the big brands that people know sort of across the globe, Nike, Coca-Cola, all that kind of stuff. Like it can scale in a major way, obviously.
100%. So one of the things about, especially, after you hit like 50, 100 million ARR, I think you need to start consciously thinking about spending on brand. And the reason is, if your top of funnel is not growing, right, because it's a funnel in the end, right? You're touching some portion like through brand campaigns. They're coming down the funnel. A B2B buyer doesn't buy a product instantly, right? It's a journey. So if you're not investing on top of funnel, what's going to happen is your CAC for bottom of funnel is going to go up over time. So you have to figure it out, like how much you should spend on top of funnel versus how much you should spend on bottom of funnel. Like 30-70, some say 30-70, some say 50-50, but you have to experiment constantly. Because remember, with your brand campaigns, you can create a huge retargeting pool as well, in the long run. So I've seen companies where they hit a ceiling after a certain point if they are not spending on brand.
So you started to touch on it there. I mean, the next question I kind of wanted to get into is, okay, so when do you do this? Is this something that post Series A, you're like instantly starting to do brand stuff? Is it sort of later on? You kind of mentioned that it happens, more, later once you're at scale, sort of 100 million of ARR. So walk us through that a little bit. Like when do you start thinking about brand? When can brand, be a helpful thing to add to your marketing mix?
I think if you think about it, when you're starting the company, when you're founding, you need a website, right? And when you're building the website, you're thinking about, okay, which color should I choose, right? What should be the style of my copy? So you're already kind of subconsciously making some calls around the brand from early on in your journey. And then if you are a PLG company, your product touches and product experiences is kind of creating the brand personality as well. So even though you're not consciously thinking about it, you have already started on the brand journey as soon as you launch a website and a product. Now, I usually tell the founders, like once they hit like 10 million AR, like 1 to 10 million ARR, they should start consciously thinking about the brand to some extent. And I'm not saying go and spend tons of advertising dollars in brand initially. It's more about like the unpaid channels. Think about what you can do from PR and thought leadership perspective. Think about what you can do from an SEO perspective. Think about what you can do from a content perspective. Think about building communities. So that 1 to 10 million is when you should probably start thinking about brand consciously. And then 50 million ARR, 50 to 100 million ARR, I would say you're going to start seeing, when you start seeing that your cost of acquisition on your bottom of funnel is going up, you need to start spending on top of funnel online, digitally. And the online digitally, I think the advantage is, like I said, you can create retargeting pools and things like that, right? So you can justify your online spend to some extent. And then after 100 million ARR, nowadays, like you just mentioned, if you drive on 101, you see all those billboards everywhere. And the reason is online advertising is getting so crowded, it's hard to grab people's attention, right? So a TV ad or an out-of-home ad, you have a captive audience to some extent. Like you cannot use ad blockers for billboards, for example.
Yeah. Can't close your eyes while you're driving down the freeway.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why you see like nowadays, like kind of out-of-home is coming back because a lot of people realizes that online you're not getting a lot. It's getting kind of getting so crowded that it's hard to get people's attention.
Yeah. So so what it sounds like is that, when you're thinking about when do you do brand, it's not really this kind of binary decision or it's like a switch that you flip. It was off and now it's on. There's sort of different phases. Kind of what I heard from you describing the journey is like the first phase, once you get, obviously you put something up, like we picked the color blue and we have this font and we talk this way. There's some basic initial stuff, like you have to have a presence. But kind of once you get to that $10 million scale, what you're really focused on is defining your brand. Like, what is your brand? And sort of before you can amplify something, you have to have it as a thing. It has to be defined. So that's kind of like the first motion. Then the next motion is like once the brand's defined, some of the things you mentioned like PR and some of those community, some of those things you might do in those earlier sort of phases, scale up phases, that's sort of brand awareness. And then at some point, you're going to have reached a certain level of maturity with knowing what your brand is, people being aware of your brand, and then also scale for yourself and just looking at your overall funnel. And that's where you do brand amplification. And that's what people mean when they say like brand marketing traditionally. That's when you're going to be like, going to the TV channels, the out-of-home channels, and those kinds of things. So there's kind of step 1, 2, 3. It's crawl, walk, run versus sort of like I wasn't doing brand yesterday and now I'm doing brand today.
I like that. Crawl, walk, run. I'm going to use that.
Awesome. So we're going to get into more of the details of that. I mean, that's kind of like the high level view, but like obviously understanding the how of how do you do brand is super important. So maybe let's get into that. Like, what does that look like for B2B marketing, and what does a brand strategy look like for B2B?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I think where it begins is what's the mission and the vision of the company. Like defining that early on is going to be super, super important once you go down the path of defining what your brand is going to be. So for example, Nike, right? It's like one of those brands very, very well known. Everyone knows Just Do It, right? And the Just Do It mission statement is so powerful because it's not about winning or losing. It's about participation, right? And it resonates so well with their, target audience. I think Google had this mission statement that they want to organize the world's information, right, and make it accessible, right? That mission statement is so powerful, right? It's much easier to define, what your brand is going to be once understand like what's the mission statement is going to be. And mission vision is not about, especially when it comes to brand, it's not about speeds and feeds. You're not talking about features, right? So once you define the mission and vision, I think the next question becomes like, what's going to be your brand identity, right? How you identifying your brand attributes. Sometime, if you think about it, some companies already have kind of over time have built out a value system for themselves. I always think that your external brand attributes and your internal cultural values, they need to match with each other. They can't be completely, out of whack. So you can get some ideas from your internal cultural values. So very, very specific.
This is something that I actually have firsthand experience with, and it was totally counterintuitive to me when I first got exposed to it, but it was actually for OpenView. So a handful of years ago, we hired a branding agency. And we wanted to sort of, improve our look and feel and all that kind of stuff and graduate to the next level. And the branding agency, again, I kind of went in with this perception of, well, they're going to help us figure out like how to make a cool logo and like get our own font and like it's going to be great and like pick our colors and all that kind of stuff. But their first question was exactly that. It's like, what's your mission? What's your vision? What's your values? And again, it sort of caught me off guard. It's like, why does that matter? It's like, well, brand is not colors. Brand is not font. Brand is, as you're saying, it's an identity.
Yes.
And so what's the mission? Like, why does everybody come to work? Like, why does this company need to exist? That's the starting point of your brand. And that's way more important than like, do you like blue or purple better?
100%. You nailed it. And then basically, once you define your mission, your value statement, your values, you basically come up with the brand attributes. And to give you a specific example, for 1Password, for example, some of the brand attributes we came up with is like human, humorous, humble, which was kind of, a testament to the internal culture of the company as well. And then we identified a brand archetype as well. And strangely enough, when we were talking about the brand archetype, like the first person which popped on our heads is Ryan Reynolds, because Ryan Reynolds is he's a Canadian, right?
Yep, just like 1Password.
Just like 1Password, and you can think about all those three attributes really map well. So this is the reason we selected like Ryan as a kind of a brand ambassador. So after you define your brand attribute, then you basically come what do you call a visual identity and a verbal identity. Verbal identity is not very different from your brand attributes because it's kind of intuitive. Once you define the brand attributes, you know what your written personality or your copy personality.
Yeah, you speak that way that's consistent with your identity.
Identity, right? And then the visual stuff is the interesting stuff. And this is the thing. But because I was trying to do a rebrand during 1Password, so the work is still going on, I know that. So one of the things I told when I was working with this agency, I'm like, show me a website. I will tell you whether it's a tech website or a non-tech website. Because every single tech website you go to, like the visual identity has either illustrations or stick figures. I think stick figures stick figures suddenly was the new thing. Like every single tech company in Silicon Valley was doing it, which is very interesting. Whereas if you go to a CPG company, for example, their visual identity is so different. And one of the things I was talking about, like, as a visual identity, you need to really stand out. MailChimp is a great example, right? If you go to any typical enterprise B2B company, everyone uses blue color. Everyone. Like blue is the de
Blue's
facto.
the way to go. Nobody ever got fired for picking blue as your brand color, yeah.
Right. So MailChimp, for example, right? The colors really stand out. And this is the reason. Subconsciously, you're not thinking about it, but subconsciously it's having an impact on you because that's one of the reasons probably.
It's different. Yeah,
it's different.
Catches your eye.
It stands out. Yeah. So the visual identity also is part of that. Like once you defined, kind of it because it's a reflection of your brand identity to some extent. One of the things you have to remember when you're working on the visual identity that your product UX and your visual identity needs to match with each other. They cannot be like your internal design systems and your external design system. They need to be consistent, or it's going to be a really horrible experience for a customer.
Yeah, I could imagine. You mentioned 1Password. Like some of the brand attributes were human and humorous. But it's a security product, and so if you get into the security product and it feels like super intense and like this is a knock and like all these types of things, like more of an enterprise cybersecurity platform, it's not going to feel humorous and human. So yeah, like it has to match once you actually get into the experience.
100%. So if you're talking, the next thing is if you're talking about companies which have single product, it's very easy. Right? Now, if it's a multi-product company, then the question becomes, hey, do you want to be a house of brand or a branded house? So just for the audience who are not aware what it means, a house of brand is what usually CPG companies do, right? For example, you don't know Dove is owned by Unilever, for example, right? But Unilever is the parent company. They don't invest a lot on their parent company brand. They invest a lot on their sub-brands. So that's kind of an example of a house of brand. A branded house is basically what usually the car companies do, right? They invest in, for example, Honda. Then you have Honda Civic, Honda Odyssey, right? So that was the debate. Like I remember early days in Atlassian because everyone knew Jira. No one knew Atlassian. So the debate was, hey, what should we do? Should we invest in the Jira brand or should we invest in the Atlassian brand? And we made a conscious call of, we're going to go with a branded house. So now if you go and see any product in the Atlassian family, it has Atlassian in front. So it says Atlassian Jira, Atlassian Confluence, I think Trello is the only one which has because it doesn't go, because the Trello personality, brand personality, and Atlassian brand personality is very different. But all the other brands is like that. Now, Google, for example, has a mixture, right? In initial days, every single product was basically a branded house with like Google Mail, for example, right? Google Calendar, Google Docs. And then what they did is they went to a house of brand concept for the brands they want to invest in the long run. So Android, Chrome, YouTube, they have their own brand identities, for example. So that's the other call. If you're a multi-product company, you need to think about that as well.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because there's different paths to go down for a brand, and this idea of house of brands or branded house. Yeah, I've never heard it mentioned that way. How do you know which one is best for you?
I think if you're a startup, right, branded house makes sense. I mean, then it doesn't matter. Like if you're in an early stage company, you cannot afford to have like a multiple brands, because you have to invest in those brands, right? Google can afford to do it. Microsoft can afford to do it. Like Amazon can. Like all the big companies, they have a huge brand budget. They can afford to do it. But the startups, they can't. So in early stages, even if you are doing like 2 or 3 products, you should go for branded house, because that's what makes sense.
Yeah, and I do think that's really good, specific, tactical advice to anybody that's listening right now. The name of your company should be the name of your product. Don't make it too hard for yourself, right? That's usually what you see, but every now and then I still see, young startups, still getting traction. It's like, our company is called this, and we have 2 products, and they're called this and that. And like, none of them are the same. And it's like, dude, You're making it too hard on yourself. Like, make it easy. Just pick one name.
And think about SEO as well. SEO becomes harder if you have like 3 different product names. And it's,
Yeah, even buying your branded keywords, like you got to buy 3 of them. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Okay, so that's kind of, how do you do brand? What does brand look like in B2B? What does that journey look like? Defining it and really kind of getting it. It's not just picking the colors, just picking the logo. There's a lot to it around identity, attributes, voice. It needs to match your, product marketing. It needs to match the design in your product and the user experience. All this stuff needs to be consistent. So, okay, you've done that. Now you're getting close to 100 million of ARR, and you're like, all right, I want to amplify this. I want to do brand marketing. What are the channels that you should think about there, and how do you measure the impact of brand marketing once you sort of flip that switch?
Yeah, so the first, I think I touched on it. The first thing, the digital channel becomes important, right? Even before you spend out of home, you should start investing in digital channels, and there are various ways you can do it. You can take over. There's this concept called site takeovers. Like if you go to CNN.com, you'll see something on the top, for example, right? The cool thing about doing digital is you can easily measure it. Like anything can be measured like online, right? So even if like someone sees your ad or sees your video, for example, which is on a third-party site, and they come later to your website, you can track them very easily, right? So that's where it's powerful. So online channel, there are like lots of ways you can do like top of funnel spend. So online is where you should start initially. And then the next one is basically, I think at a certain point in time in the near future, you have to start thinking about out of home. You have to start thinking about streaming. I'm not saying TV, I'm saying streaming. And the reason I'm saying streaming is because streaming nowadays, you can do even specific targeting. So for example, when we did the Ryan Reynolds commercial, right, we partnered with this agency called M&TN Agency. And what they do is basically you can go and create, just like in Google Ads or Facebook ads, you can go and create your demographic profile of the customers you want to go after, right? And nowadays, if you notice, if you were, for example, if you're a subscriber of YouTube TV, for example, you have to log in to your account. So they know who is specifically actually watching the show. Yeah. That's why they created all this.
They're doing the hard work for marketers to make it all attributable. This is great.
Yeah. So now you can say, hey, I want to, target all this specific age group, right? Living in New York, for example, and you can even say, they work in the B2B space, for example. You can do all sorts of things nowadays with online streaming. But the holy grail is obviously Super Bowl. Like You have to do it sometime in the near future, but I don't know how effective it is. I don't know how effective it was for Coinbase. The Coinbase ad was like amazing. If you remember the Super Bowl ad they did, that was incredibly smart. These are the ways to basically think about, but one of the things you have to make sure that you measure it. And there are other ways to measure it as well. Like holistically, what you can do, you can hire an agency, for example, and they can measure like how much your, for example, awareness has gone up over time. And you can do even segment specific, like SMB, mid-market, enterprise, for example. Then there are other agencies which measure something called the brand equity. So, for example, at 1Password, we're using this agency called Blue Ocean, basically, which basically spewed us a score every month, saying how are we doing from a brand perspective.
Got it. So the good news is that it's measurable, because I do think that, and historically it was this way, and I think a lot of people still have this perception is that brand is something that is almost impossible to track. How do you track the, efficacy unless there's a specific, kind of promo code in a print, ad that you do, or sort of in a radio ad or in a TV ad or in a billboard? Like, how do you track those things? There's not pixels on those things. But through sort of, streaming, and then some of these kind of new supporting technologies, agency partners, a lot of this stuff, if not all of it, is much more attributable, much more trackable, and you can actually see the impact of your brand. It's not just sort of like, well, we're going to spend $1 million and hope for the best. You can actually see where it went and what it did.
I was just talking to a founder, Blake. You cannot imagine the kind of companies like which are getting founded. That company, what they do is they have this entire inventory of billboards online. So you can specifically go and pick the online, like the billboards, see them where they are exactly. They have pictures for it. And you can say, hey, I want to buy space on this billboard from this time to this time. And then they basically integrate with your internal, data systems, and they basically tell you how effective your out-of-home campaigns are, going. So nowadays, to your point, everything's measurable.
Yeah. And is the out-of-home stuff, is that using like geofencing, or is that as attributable as other brand channels?
So, I'll use a very good example because Google, in the initial days when they ran the Chrome ads, they did basically picked a specific location, ran the ads, saw how effective it was, and then make the call of taking it national. So, for example, I think they picked Boston initially to run some experiments and see if it's working or not. But it's easier for B2C companies. It's harder for B2B companies to some extent to do like geofencing. But nowadays, there are a lot of interesting ways you can measure. Like I was just talking to another vendor. What they do is basically they track your mobile phones, and based on your mobile activity, like if you come to the website later on, they can tell you like you saw the out-of-home ad and you basically came to the website. And that is based on the out-of-home ad running at a location X, for example.
Yeah, I like that as another way. You gave the Google example, but if you're gonna, hey, let's saturate a city and let's see if we get a lot more people signing up in that city. And I agree that like in B2B, it's a little, or at least traditional B2B, it's a little bit harder because blast the entire city and hopefully you get all of the CMOs while you're at it, like because that's our only buyer. That's a little bit harder. But with PLG, increasingly like you're kind of building everyone products. It's like Calendly can be used by everybody. Zoom can be used by everybody, as it was in the pandemic. And Slack can be used by virtually everybody. 1Password can be used by everybody. Me as a consumer or me as a CISO as well. And so PLG and building these mass market products that serve all audiences actually open up a much bigger brand opportunity for PLG companies and for B2B in general.
Yep. You are saying my mantra.
So in closing, for founders and marketers that are listening right now who want to take action on this advice and they want to take a first step, but they're not yet at that $100 million of ARR, they're not going to sort of buy the Super Bowl ad this upcoming year. What's the first step? Where do they begin? What should they be focused on first?
You just need a pen and a pencil. No, not pen and pencil. Pen and paper. You need a pen and paper. Just take a pen and paper, sit down, think about what's the mission statement, what do you want to achieve? Like, what do you want your product to achieve? Like, start there. And then you kind of already know to some extent, if you're the founder, like what is the kind of the internal value system of the company. Write down those value system and then go from there. Like, define like what you want your personality to be like, check, like do some testing with, like talk to some few customers and then go from there. I don't think you need to invest like millions of dollars to start on your brand journey. You can start on your brand journey very easily.
Well, back to that sort of crawl, walk, run. The first starting point is brand definition. What is my identity? Who am I? How do I want to be perceived in the world? And like, you can get that done day one. So thinking about those different steps, and it's, again, back to where we started, that it's not this binary switch that like I wasn't doing brand yesterday and now I'm doing brand today. You can think about it sort of in this progressive thing, and you always need to build that foundation and then ensure, back to sort of some of the things we were talking about, consistency. That from your mission, vision, values, to your brand voice and brand attributes, to your user experience, to your product marketing, to just the design system that you use for your product, does it all match? Does it all feel consistent? Or is it a little bit of, kind of disjointed? That's a really good place to start. So amazing advice, both for scaled companies as well as younger companies. This has been awesome, Raj. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Build Podcast.
Thanks for the invitation.